All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the third meeting of our five-part series in the National Reading Panel Report. We're hoping that you had some chances to read through the fluency section in preparation for tonight. My name is Rachel Donnelly. I am the current president of the Reading League Maryland. Our goal is to advance awareness and use of evidence-based reading instruction to improve student literacy in Maryland. We offer free membership, and we will be dropping the link to our website in the chat if anyone is interested in checking that out. We're also going to be dropping a link to a draft public comment section for MSDE's literacy policy. There has been a lot of discussion going on about the policy, especially with a third grade retention clause. And so I'd encourage everybody to read through that and to submit feedback. Feedback is due by July 19th. So there's a timeline associated with that. But I'm really excited for tonight. As a practicing school psychologist who makes frequent use of curriculum-based assessment, curriculum-based measurement, I certainly benefit from Dr. Hasbrouck's work, and I frequently find myself searching, Hasbrook fluency norms on Google to pull data and information to help myself out, to help my teams out. And I've done that more times than I can count. But I'm going to turn things over right now to Just Right Reader, who's going to introduce Dr. Hasbrouck, and they are our sponsor tonight. And we're really appreciative of the work that they do and their support with this event series. So welcome everybody, and I'll pass it over to you, Just Right Reader.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kim, and I'm with Just Right Reader. If this is your first time joining us or you've never heard of Just Right Reader, we're all about bringing the science of reading and the joy of reading together into decodables to help students become stronger, more fluent readers. So we offer classroom libraries with over 750 titles in English and Spanish, as well as personalized take-home packs to provide personalized reading practice for growing readers. We also provide webinars and symposiums for educators, and we actually have an upcoming symposium with Dr. Julia Lindsay, July 30th, all about small group instruction, but we'll have a registration link for that available soon, and as always, our events are free. So you'll find my email on the bottom of this slide if you have any questions about Just Right Reader. Feel free to reach out to me, send me an email, and you can also scan the QR code if you'd like to request a sample of our decodables. And also feel free to visit our website at justrightreader.com. So I'm so excited to introduce our presenter tonight, Dr. Jan Hasbrouck. Dr. Hasbrouck is a researcher, educational consultant, and author who works with schools and agencies in the United States and internationally. Dr. Hasbrouck has worked as a reading specialist and literacy coach for 15 years and later became a professor. Her research in reading fluency and academic assessment and interventions and instructional coaching has been widely published, and she's the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books along with some assessment tools. She continues to collaborate with researchers and school colleagues on projects related to reading interventions and assessment and instructional coaching. So this evening, we're excited to hear about fluency from Dr. Hasbrouck. So Dr. Hasbrouck, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here with a growing group of people. We keep having people enter. That's fantastic. So I will share my screen that we got set up earlier and be ready to go. So thank you, Kim, and the team from the Reading League that put this together. So much work, and what a great idea to spend some time going back and looking at the message of the National Reading Panel. So much is still relevant. I was saying to folks when I logged in tonight that I did attend Matt's first session on phoneme awareness, was very impressed with that presentation. And last week I attended most of Holly Lane's presentation on phonics. They both did such a good job. So they bar for me. I hope that I can make this as relevant and informative to all of you as they did. I have done a lot of work in the area of fluency, and I always like to start when I talk about fluency with acknowledging a couple of things. One is a book that I wrote. So I want to acknowledge that the relatively short time we have here together, I'm taking ideas, a lot of what I'm going to share tonight, although specific National Reading Panel report, a lot of the ideas about fluency are in this book. Should you want to dig a little bit further, there's shows there, two different books. It's actually the bigger one. The purple one is the full book. And the white one is, in fact, a smaller, more like a Cliff Notes version of the book. But the other reason I like to share this is because I want to acknowledge that for many years, I've done a lot of work in the area of fluency with a wonderful, wonderful colleague, Deb Glazer. I'll be talking about Deb tonight and the way she has contributed and influenced my own thinking about fluency. So that's a resource for you. Another resource, and it also involved Deb, was we were asked a few years ago now to write a brief about literacy. This was when Doug Fisher was president of ILA, and Doug and I have worked together for a very long time, and he wanted to be sure that the ILA was taking note of the fact Jerry Tyndall and I had just done an update for our reading. So we created this brief, and I think it's still available. It's a free publication of ILA. And I also, a few years ago now, the national group of the which has a journal. I'm sure most of you know about that wonderful journal. They had a special issue devoted to an update of the National Reading Panel report. It was the 20th anniversary, and they asked me to write the chapter or the article about fluency in that journal. Some of you may subscribe to that and have access to that, so I'm going to be referring to what I wrote in there as well. And already briefly mentioned was some of the research that I've done that has really got a lot of attention over the years. Jerry Tyndall and I did actually 3 studies. I've highlighted the first one there in 1990. It's a very small study, but it was cited in the National Panel report. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk about these norms a bit more too. So the National Reading Panel, this report that they did, both Holly and Matt talked quite a bit about the history of the National Reading Panel and came to be, and the 2 years that group of researchers worked to synthesize what we knew at that point about reading, and created this amazing report that some of you may have never seen in its physical form. It's available digitally online, but many of us do and did and do still have copies of a big, thick green book. There was also a smaller version of a summary version that was available to people. So we're going to, it was a very full report, and you're going to hear about most of it, but I'm here tonight just to talk about fluency. And for the purposes of organizing your thinking and also for questions, I'd like to let you know that I'm going to be organizing my presentation in these 3 parts. I'm going to start with an overview of what fluency is, looking at how the National Reading Panel described fluency and some updated definitions of fluency. Then I'm going to be talking about what the panel talked about teaching fluency and new ideas we have about that. And then finally about assessing fluency. So if your questions come up and you have a question about teaching fluency, it would be helpful if you wait till that section, because I might answer your question, and it will keep me on track a little bit more. And I will get to assessing toward the end of this presentation. So questions related to that, if you can wait for that. And there are recordings available. I can see that in the chat, and there are handouts also for tonight's session that are available to you. Okay, so let's start as promised with defining fluency. So I'm going to be really organizing this presentation around what was in, as I was asked to do, talking about fluency from the perspective of the National Reading Panel report. And there were 3 people on that committee, that subcommittee, whole panel, 2 co-chairs, Jay Samuels and Tim Shanahan co-chaired that, along with Sally Shaywitz. They did the heavy lift on the topic of fluency. And when I was asked to do this presentation, it made me think about reaching out to Tim. Tim and I have had the opportunity to work together on a variety of projects for almost about 20 years, right after he wrapped up his work on the National Fluency or on the National Reading Panel. So I know Tim quite well. He knows me. We do a lot of interacting and bouncing ideas off each other and various things. So when I was getting ready to write this, I wrote him an email as I was preparing this, and just said that I've been asked to do, or the Maryland branch of the Reading League was doing this 5-part session, that I agreed to do the webinar tonight on fluency. And I wanted to know if he had any thoughts or ideas or anything that he wanted me to share or emphasize or correct or explain. I also mentioned that I would be not only using the National Reading Panel report, but also a document that he wrote on his own, a summary, and a few years later, 5 years later, the National Reading Panel report, Practical Advice for Teachers. I recently found this and I thought it was very helpful, so I mentioned that to Tim as well. And this is in your handouts, but you can find it. It's where I found it. I'm sure it's multiple locations, but I found it at thereadingforum.com, and I will be referring to those points later. So very kindly, the next day, Tim wrote back to me an email that I will be sharing along the way as various, as it is relevant to what we're talking about. So you can see, he said overall that he's pretty happy with the NRP findings. They've held up for the most part, but you can also see fuzzed out there a little bit. He did have some things to share, so I'll share those with you. So the each of the chapters or sections in the National Reading Panel report had an overarching, they all stated, why did we include fluency? Why did we include phoneme awareness? Why did we include a section on vocabulary? For this section, they said the overarching guiding question was, does guided, repeated oral reading instruction improve fluency and reading comprehension? If so, how is this instruction best provided? Which, reading that overarching question kind of surprised me. It's been a while since I've done a deep dive into the chapter. And this is really narrowly focused on just the instruction of reading fluency, and one kind of instruction, guided repeated reading. And that's where they started. But it did expand. They wrote further in the report itself that they decided to review the changing aspects of fluency because it's an essential aspect of reading. They decided 2 different approaches to teaching fluency, both the repeated oral reading or guided repeated oral reading that they mentioned originally, and then What is the effectiveness of increasing the amount of reading? They talk about it different ways in the chapter, but basically that means encouraging kids to read as much as possible and usually silently. So those were two. And the third was, are schools ready? This sentence I found kind of awkward. Are the approaches ready? Can repeated reading and wide silent reading be used in schools? If they are, they also mentioned or talked about their rationale. Why are we including a chapter on fluency? And it really comes down to comprehension. If you read that chapter closely, and if you read anything worth reading on fluency, including anything that Deb and I have read or written, the reason we spend time talking about fluency is because of comprehension. Fluency is often, when we talk about it as educators, we often sort of go too quickly to this notion that fluent reading is reading fast. And we kind of stop there sometimes. Well, first of all, fluent reading is not reading fast. And second of all, we should skip right over that part. Actually, that one little narrow aspect of fluency, which is rate. And talk about, we want to think about fluency and talk about fluency and teach fluency and assess fluency because of comprehension. We need to be focusing that. And the National Reading Panel really did. Fluency is important because of comprehension. So defining fluency, what did the National Reading Panel say about fluency? They said a couple of things. They said fluent readers can read with speed, accuracy, and proper expression. A little bit later, they said fluency is the ability to read a text quickly, accurately, and with proper expression. They also said that fluency requires high-speed word recognition. So those are generally the way they described it, fluency. So I would say, is this still correct? Have we, is this the way they would say it these days? I did find it interesting that in the little pamphlet that Tim wrote by himself, the other two authors were not involved in this, 5 years later, he changed it up a little bit. His definition in that book is that oral reading fluency is the ability to read text aloud with accuracy, speed, and proper expression, which is much more detailed. They're not saying fluency is the ability to read text, which is much more, it's much more accurate to say more specifically oral reading fluency. Because fluency can be applied to math, and fluency can be applied to piano playing, and fluency can be applied to any skill. So when they say fluency is the ability to read a text quickly, I suppose it's in the context of the National Reading Panel, so it's okay to say that. But I think Tim's definition in 2005 gets closer, but I don't think it gets close enough, actually. And I'll show you why. In our book, and in my subsequent writings, Deb and I define fluency as reasonably accurate reading. So just like the National Reading Panel, we put accuracy in there, and we put it first. The National Reading, the NRP report did not put it first. They put quickly and speed, and that's what they were emphasizing. 5 years later, well, Tim and I had worked together for a while at that point, and his thinking on fluency was shifting. I don't take credit for shifting his thinking, but we had had discussions about how much the NRP report emphasized speed. And he said, yeah, I wouldn't do it that way. So we say accuracy, and we say reasonably accuracy. We put that first at an appropriate rate. It's not about fast. It's about appropriate. Sometimes we should read more slowly. Sometimes it's a perfect thing to read a little bit more quickly, but it needs to be appropriate for the task. And then we also, in our definition, included expression, just like the NRP report did. Suitable expression is the But we went further. We went further because we looked at this research that the National Reading Panel did. And so we went a little further that said fluency, reading fluency, passage reading fluency. We hope anyway that it leads to accurate and deep comprehension and motivation. Now, the comprehension piece in our definition, or that component in our definition, is very justified by research. Certainly, all the research that the NRP reviewed connected fluency to comprehension. So we're real clear that comprehension is connected to fluency, and it really, we think, should be part of a definition. Motivation is not as connected to fluency from research, but not everything has been studied really closely, and motivation is a really difficult thing to study. But when we don't have good scientific evidence that says we know something is not true, we can speculate about its truthfulness if we have clinical experience. And certainly Deb and I have lots and lots of clinical experience. So we feel justified in connecting motivation to fluency too. And I see there's a couple of questions. Kelly, reasonably accurate. When I do a full day workshop or even a half day workshop on fluency, we go into great detail about this, but it's really quite high. The most recent research studies put the range between 95 and 98% accuracy in order to understand. So this is all about comprehension. Fluency is all about comprehension. So the accuracy levels that have been identified as necessary for comprehension are high. You can't go really below 95% accuracy and still hoped to reasonably comprehend what you're reading. And accuracy in this case really means not only can you identify what the word is, but what the word means. That's what we mean about accuracy when we're talking about fluency and comprehension, which should make sense. You can't comprehend if you just know that it says what it says. You can identify the word, but we also need to make sure our students know the meaning of the words as they read. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Let's also spend some time talking about automaticity. I wanted to do that for sure. Well, let me stop there because I see Rochelle has a question wondering the definition when conducting research. It's a mixed bag. It is definitely a mixed bag, and that's one of the challenges with fluency research. As we're getting more sophisticated and really understanding, as you'll see when we go through the definition, researchers, we hope, are getting more precise about what they're actually studying instead of saying fluent reading. Well, are we talking about silent reading? Are we talking about oral reading? Are we talking about reading at grade level text? Are we talking about reading that has supports or no supports? We need our researchers to really define all the parameters when they use the term reading fluency, because we're not even done talking about all the parameters of it. So very, very astute question that you asked there. So I was going to, when I was preparing this presentation, I knew I was going to talk about automaticity. That's a really important thing to talk about. But in Tim's email, that's one of the first things he said. I know you'll do a good job of stressing the issue, that the issue is automaticity rather than speed. Yeah, they figured that out. Though we do use speed to estimate automaticity. I'm not sure I would agree with him on that. Speed or rate, the term I prefer to use, is a component of automaticity, but we don't use speed alone to estimate automaticity. He does say we have to be careful not to artificially boost a reader's speed, since that won't help students read better. Yes, much more sophisticated thinking about what fluency is than some of the wording of the original report. So even though the report, the National Reading Panel report, did talk about automaticity, but not in a very clear way, I don't think. They said automaticity involves the processing of complex information that ordinarily requires long periods of training before the behavior can be executed with little effort or attention. Okay, is that the best way to talk about automaticity? There were quite a few sentences in this section that I thought could use some editing. I prefer to say automaticity is the combination of accuracy and rate, and it's in that order, with that level of importance. Accuracy has to be the foundation of automaticity, and then we layer in rate, and it's those combinations, not just speed but rate, and always in combination with accuracy. So let's visit some of the changing concepts. That's what they said they wanted to do, is even back then, 24 years ago, look at the changing concepts of fluency. So they wrote more recent conceptualizations of fluency, and this is their quote. This is from the National Reading Panel report, but they're quoting some research. More recent conceptualizations have been extended beyond word recognition and may embrace comprehension processes as well. And they went on in the report to say, yes, indeed, fluency should include comprehension processes, which is why Deb and I actually included it in our definition. They also wrote about that fluency requires high-speed word recognition, what we might say is sight words. In order to be a fluent reader, you need to have a significant number, a lexicon of sight words, because that frees a reader's cognitive resources. Meaning of text can be the focus of attention. This is another sentence that's just exemplary of the fact that a careful read of this report really does connect fluency with comprehension. Maybe not as overtly as some of us would have liked, but it's there, woven through their discussion. And when I read that we need sight words, that takes me to thinking about the genius of Scarborough's rope, where she, of course, because she knew and knows this same research that the National Reading Panel looked at, that if you're going to end up with the goal of skilled reading, you need to have sight recognition of familiar words. That's part embedded in the definition of word recognition. It has to become increasingly automatic. It has to be, the panel said high-speed word recognition, but it's really coming to the same conclusion, because that has to be there if we wanted to get to that goal of skilled reading, represented by that tightly woven rope. And that tightly woven rope, since I first laid my eyes on Scarborough's infographic, to me, that represents fluency. That tightly woven rope are all of those components: increasingly strategic use of language, increasingly automatic recognition of words, can end up with skilled reading, which is fluency. It's the execution and coordination of all those component pieces. So what else did the report say? Well, one of the things I know, it's not what the panel said, because this is research, not cite. This research came after the panel report, but it's emblematic of the continued work that's being done. There's a lot more attention being paid over the last 20 years on what does it really take to be a fluent reader. And these folks, these Australian researchers, talked about vocabulary. If you're going to be a skillful fluent reader, not only do you need sight words, but you need vocabulary, and we could use semantics for that. We need those sight words, and we need vocabulary in order to acquire sight words. This is the growing sophistication, thanks in large part to Linnea Airy, who really helped us take a deep, careful look at what we mean by sight words. So Castles and Nation are looking at the fact that not only can you recognize the letter sequence, but if you know what that word means, you have a higher likelihood of mapping that orthographically and making that actually become a sight word. So in the report, they did talk a little bit about this, some of the components that it takes beyond just words that they had previously mentioned, that syntax is important for fluency, how to group words appropriately together, which is also part of Scarborough's rope, because she included this in the description of the components of language comprehension that have to be increasingly strategically involved so we can get to that skilled reading, so we get to fluency. And all of this is really a reminder that we should be thinking about fluency or passage reading fluency as a complex outcome. Long ago, I shifted my thinking and my writing and my the way I describe fluency. I used to think about fluency as a skill, and we really need to be thinking of fluency as an outcome. It's not a skill. It is the outcome of the mastery of multiple skills that affect and intertwine with each other. And Alicia, thank you for reminding us about the wonderful and so deeply missed William Van Cleve, who used to say his superpower was syntax. Yes. So the concepts of fluency are still changing. This week, just as I was wrapping up work on this presentation, I read another study about fluency and about the role of word recognition and vocabulary development. And these folks, Giorgio and colleagues, have written several articles about this. They're theorizing and acquiring evidence for the complexity of what happens when we're attempting to read fluently. That our brain is, if it is fluent, if we are reading fluently, we are efficiently processing multiple items in a serial format. They've coined the term cascaded processing. So that is their very new and ongoing contribution, understanding of how the brain becomes a fluent brain. So I will move on from that. If there's, I'll pause and take a little sip of water and see if there's another question about definition before I move on to teaching, because that's what's next. And if anything occurs to you along the way, you please feel free to add that in. So let's talk about teaching. What did the NRP say about this? Well, first they were asking questions. They focused this is what the whole point of the chapter or the section was about originally, was about teaching. So they wrote this: how does one become fluent? So fluent in reading that words are recognized accurately, quickly, and with ease, and so that a text sounds like spoken language when read aloud. How does that happen? Well, they said that conventional wisdom is that fluency skills develop only through extended practice, in which large quantities of material are read. So that was the belief that that's the way to become fluent. And what they should have said is not just fluent, and it's not fluency skills. I think there's a lot that would be nuanced, changed a little bit if they were writing this today. But they should talk about passage reading fluency develops through extended practice of reading text. So what the panel did 24 years ago is looked at two areas that had some evidence of effectiveness, or at least they wanted to assess the possible effectiveness. There were many studies that they could look at that involved oral repeated reading repeated oral reading, guided repeated reading, different terminologies were used. But when kids are rereading text, they also wanted to look at silent reading and to see if that helped our students develop fluent readers. So one of the things that I took note of when I was asked to write the update, the 20-year update for the Reading League and in their journal, I wrote about some things that are not in the National Reading Panel report. And perhaps it's because this was written the year after the panel published their report, but I know Marianne Wolf was doing work in this area, and I wish that they had included this because it's so important. What Marianne and her colleague did was remind us that that end goal that we're thinking about a lot when we say fluency, and we're really meaning passage reading fluency, to get there, or to that tightly woven rope that Hollis Scarborough has in her infographic, they remind us that that end goal, reading fluency, passage reading fluency, develops in progressions. This is such a thoughtful article. If you have real interest in getting real nerdy and going deeply on fluency, you should get a hold of this article. They write so accurately that accuracy, then automaticity. See how they do that? Accuracy first, then we layer in rate and we get to automaticity. Accuracy, then automaticity starts at the letter level, the letter pattern level, and the word level. And then once we get to meaningful phrases and text, not only accuracy and automaticity, but semantic and syntactic processes. This is the foundation that we all need to be thinking about, especially those of us who work with really young, beginning, novice readers. We want to get them to that tightly woven rope. We have to think about accuracy, 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 and automaticity woven together, letter level, the word level, the phrase level, and the sentence level. And if we do that, if we focus on that in our instruction, then we can hope that fluent, effortless reading of text can happen. And we want that to happen because that way attention can be allocated fully allocated to comprehension. And thank you, Carlene, for dropping in a link to that article. I remember reading that and thinking, okay, this is really shifting my thinking about what fluency is and how I should talk about it, how I should think about it, and how I should teach it. So there's that word, automaticity, that Tim reminded me in the email. Be sure to talk about automaticity. That the National Reading Panel talked about what automaticity is. It's the processing of complex information that ordinarily requires long periods of training before the behavior can be executed with little effort or attention. They're not wrong, but that's really complex. How about we just think about automaticity as accuracy plus rate? Accuracy first. We have to maintain that foundation of accuracy, at least reasonable accuracy, as we add in rate, if we want to get to fluent reading, fluent passage reading, and comprehension eventually. So what is the effective reading instruction? So as I said, the panel decided to explore two things: repeated oral reading. They described it different ways: guided repeated oral reading, and silent reading practice. Is that it? Is that what we should be looking at when we want to talk about fluency? If they had more deeply talked about fluency, more accurately talked about fluency, that included the progressive development of reading, then I think they would have expanded it, because reading fluency, passage reading fluency, develops in progressions, as we have talked about. And things, just repeated reading of text and silent reading doesn't really address that. So in our book, the book that Deb and I wrote, we have 2 chapters on teaching fluency. And in our work, we quoted the brilliant Melanie Kuhn and colleagues who said this. We fully agree with that. It is critical that we establish instruction that assists learners in becoming truly fluent readers rather than just fast ones. This is not about speed. It's not about fast reading. We want fluency, and fluency is automaticity, it's accuracy, rate, and expression that leads to comprehension. That's what we want, truly fluent readers. So our instruction needs to support that, not just getting our kids to read fast. We also, in our book and in every presentation that I make about reading fluency, I am going to quote Roxanne Hudson, who is a professor at here in Seattle, Washington, where I live at the University of Washington, and Holly Lane, and their colleague, who wrote this brilliant thing about fluency. The growth of reading fluency in all its multifaceted glory is the outcome of many different kinds of instruction, not just repeatedly reading text. We need lots of different kinds of instruction. They certainly got it. And we can go to Scarborough's rope for a visualization of that. You need all this. You need to be teaching or making sure that language comprehension and all the components are being developed, including vocabulary and structures and background knowledge, and along with teaching students how to read words, the phonological awareness, the phonics, the alphabetic principle, and weaving that in always with word meaning and vocabulary in order to truly be a fluent reader. So that's the first part of their quote. We need, I love that they think about reading fluency as multifaceted glory. I totally agree with that. And they need many different kinds of instruction, but they go on to say that that instruction has to be coupled with large amounts of carefully orchestrated reading practice. This is getting closer to the narrow discussion of teaching that the National Reading Panel did. Practice or silent reading practice. You need that, absolutely. But what Hudson et al. Remind us, to get to that multifaceted glory, you need to be sure that the instruction is happening as well. So let me stop and look. I see there's a couple of questions here. Thank you for those connections to the articles. I know you make a distinction between speed and rate and prefer rate rather than speed. I just think it sounds a little bit more sophisticated. And I think in so many ways, we need to help our teacher colleagues and our administrator colleagues and some of our school psychologists and others to decouple fluency with speed. So and just calling it rate is not going to do that alone, but I don't know that there's really a big difference. I think it's just a little bit more sophisticated. We can measure a rate of doing something, and that's what we include in the oral reading fluency norms. That is a measure of automaticity, accuracy plus rate. So I don't know. I just prefer the word. Maybe I just think it sounds a little but maybe a little bit more sophisticated. So we're just not thinking about getting faster and faster and faster. You no longer see my screen? Is that true?
I see your screen.
Okay. Well, Sarah is not seeing my screen. I'm sorry about that, Sarah. Apparently it's not on my end, so maybe something you could do. And Kelly is asking about dear paragraph. Yeah, shrinking. Okay, lots. So I will talk about some of that. And if I don't answer your question, ask it again. What I want to go on to now is a way that Deb and I in our book frame the instruction for reading fluency. And Deb came up with this. I always want to give her credit. I thought it was so incredibly clever when she said, this is the framework we should use to talk about all instruction related to all aspects of fluency, even those early developmental stages, AAA. So this is the framework that we always say, if we were coming to your classroom to watch you teach a fluency lesson, we would be looking for these three things in every lesson, even when it's early, when we're just at that early stage of looking at letter names and letter sounds and words, AAA. So I bet if you've been paying any attention at all, you can guess what the first A is on this list. It is accuracy. Yes, indeed. And the second A that should always be there in any fluency lesson is automaticity, where we take accuracy, which comes first, layer rate on top of that, and we get another wonderful, necessary A word, which is automaticity. The third A in our framework would be comprehension, but comprehension doesn't start with an A. So Deb came up with access meaning. So how do you do that? How would you apply AAA for the outcome, the goal of ultimately fluent passage reading of grade level text with understanding, and we can always hope motivation? What does that look like across the developmental stages? So I know that Holly was talking about the reading development last week and talked about Aries phases of reading development. I'm talking similarly about the development of reading over time using slightly different terminology, but as applied to Scarborough's rope here. At the emergent stages, we might think of this as preschool, early kindergarten. AAA instruction would be teaching letter names and letter sounds, phoneme awareness, blending and segmenting, and doing that with accuracy first, and as soon as we can get meaning involved in this, we want to do that. We can do that once we get to letter names and letter sounds, because we can talk about letters representing words and names. And then, of course, we must always include language in our instruction. Once students are moved along a little bit, the typically developing reader, this might be for them kindergarten, early first grade, we might call that the novice stage. AAA would be focused on decoding words and decodable text plus language. Accuracy, to make sure the students know how to decode all those words accurately, then move toward automaticity, move more toward the rate of spoken language, include the meaning of those words, the meaning of those sentences, always. When students move to this next phase that we might call transitional, where students are reading, they've broken the code, they've cracked the code, they basically have incorporated the understanding of the alphabetic principle. They're ready to move beyond decodable text and into more authentic text, or not quite as controlled text. So here in this phase or stage of reading development, mid first grade for a lot of kids, early second grade, perhaps a little sooner for some, although many children get stuck here at this stage for the rest of their lives. What instruction should be focused on here would be the AAA, would be accessing meaning at instructional level text. But we don't want to stay here. We want to hopefully move all our students toward established readers. They're not transitional anymore. They can read and understand grade level text. And then there's those proficient readers that not only are skillful with grade level text, but can understand and read even much more challenging text. And I put an arrow there to indicate just because we've achieved this established reader, we're not done. You may know that Hollis Scarborough has said that when she first submitted her infographic to be published, it had an arrow across the bottom. She meant it to be a representation of the development of reading, and it doesn't just stop there at the end, which typically might represent middle of second grade is where we expect most readers. If we've done our job, most readers should be at least established, and then we continue to work with them. What the instruction here should be, once students are established readers, the newer research is suggesting that we leave behind instructional text and move toward the reading complex text, multiple genres, all that. It's a really newer way of thinking, but the newer research is strongly suggesting that one of the reasons we in the United States and in most English-speaking countries, I know we have at least one person here from New Zealand today, welcome. But in all English-speaking countries for decades, we've been kind of stuck at the number of readers that we bring up to a strong level of reading. And there are many of us who think that one of the reasons is because we've mistakenly believed that the best we could do for our students was have them read instructional level text. And that is not true. That was always a theory. It was never proven by research. And the theory has subsequently been proven, not to be true once they are established readers. This is real different. I want to go back and look at this, the transitional. They're not just in decodable text anymore, but they're still working it out. The rope is not fully woven together. It's not tightly woven yet. Here is where there is a role for instructional level text. But once they've moved on, they really got it. We need to move on. And this is something that Tim wanted me to share with you in his email. An issue we missed, and he's talking about in the report, an issue that we missed in the report that has been dealt with since, first in Kuhn and Stahl's literature review, is the importance of fluency training with text that kids cannot already read fluently. Studies have found that without any instructional support, students typically reduce their number of oral reading errors by about 50% on a second reading. And that isn't as straightforward as it sounds because they make different errors. But it does show that typical reading level matches the teachers are encouraged to make the just right level kind of idea don't allow for much improvement in fluency. This has been a big message from Tim, who cites the research that shows the differential and always much, much greater gains in reading when kids are taught from more challenging text. Only after they're established readers, though, and Tim makes that point. We don't do this. We don't put complex, challenging text in front of most first graders and second graders. They're just not ready for it. It would be damaging. But we've done damage. We've inhibited learning by not doing that with our students. And this is with instruction. It's fluency training is the term Tim uses. I would call it instruction. You have to remember the first A in AAA. You have to get accuracy first. So if you're putting challenging text in front of students, the first part of that lesson, maybe for a few days, is learning what the words are, decoding the words, knowing their meaning, just getting the accuracy down. That's check one. Then we move to automaticity. And as we're doing that, we bring in the meaning part of that. And welcome to all, at least one friend from New Zealand. That's just lovely. So how does fluency develop? What did the National Reading Panel say? They looked at repeated oral reading and guided repeated oral reading and silent reading, encouraging students to read more. So what about the first? They said that they looked at 77 articles But then in another sentence, they said they looked at 76 articles, so a little bit of editing again. But within those articles, it got down to 50 items where they were looking at aspects of this instruction. And then they added some older articles because they didn't feel that they had enough representation of what they were looking for. Because the problem was, and this was a question that came up earlier in the chat, how are people defining fluency? Well, even in these research articles, this is one of the things that we should all be kind of proud about and excited about, is that in the last 20 years, we have really, our field, our profession has figured out a lot about what good research is. The research done in the 70s and 80s and 90s made some important contributions, but a lot of it was very sloppy. You go back and read and you just, what were they talking about? And then they conclude, this works. But we're not actually sure what you did. So they wrote, the authors of this section, the studies that were examined presented dramatically different conceptualizations of the problem. How were the kids already fluent or not fluent, or how low were they? What actual implementations? But they finally, digging around and reviewing enough articles, they said they did feel that there was a persuasive case that repeated readings and other procedures where students read passages orally multiple times while receiving guidance or feedback, either from peers or parents or teachers, these methods are effective in improving a variety of reading skills, including reading fluency. So the takeaways are, it's beneficial to read multiple times. It's necessary to receive guidance or feedback. Let me go back to this one, reading orally multiple times, because this takes me to the final thing that Tim wrote to me in his email. He said, studies tend to find that 3 readings is usually sufficient to show improvement. That was not in the report. And this is more subsequent, better quality research. 3 readings are sufficient. And kids are usually better served by moving on to a fresh text for further. Once they've done the 3 times, let's move on to a fresh text. This is some of the work that Freddie Hebert has done, and researchers at the Iowa Research Center, that the rate of learning is lower after 3 reads than it text. So take your passage, read it 3 times, always accuracy first, automaticity, accessing meaning. 3 times, you probably squeezed as much as you're going to get out of that. Move on to a new text. Ideally, that text has at least some overlap in terms of words and concepts, vocabulary. So it's additional practice, but it's the syntax and semantics and is a little bit different. Yeah, I think that's very useful information to follow, because that's not always the guidance we get. The report also said that guided repeated oral reading and repeated reading provide students with practice that substantially improves word recognition, fluency, and to a lesser extent, reading comprehension. And this is, teasing that out is really hard, because comprehension is measured in so many different ways, but and comprehension is really difficult to improve. It just is. It's a very, very complex thing. They also reminded us, though, way back when in this original report, that you can't just do this by itself and expect good things to happen. You can't just do repeated reading. You can't just do peer reading practice. You can't just do repeated reading. That's not going to be enough. These things happen. Word recognition improvement, fluency, and comprehension appear to improve in the context of an overall reading program, not just standalone programs. Yay. I'm so glad that that was in there. I don't think it's always paid attention to, that we need a comprehensive, coherent program that addresses all of the things that are included in the reading rope. We can't just work on fluency and expect good things to happen. So he went on with a little bit more detail in the report that he wrote by himself 5 years later. Fluency instruction has been shown to improve oral reading fluency itself, but also decoding, word recognition, silent reading comprehension, and overall reading achievement as measured by achievement tests. So a positive conclusion about repeated oral reading and guided repeated oral reading. We should do it. We should do it in minimum amounts. 3 times is enough, but it can be helpful. So then they turned their attention to silent reading, or encouraging students to read more. They quickly ran into a roadblock because they only found 14 studies. And in those 14 studies, also, there were all kinds of stuff done with different ages of kids, different amounts of reading, different methodologies using different terms. Sustained silent reading had different acronyms and different methodologies. And in these 14 studies, it crossed from 2nd grade all the way up through high school. So there just wasn't a good, juicy amount of data to look at, partly because they had so little to work with. They did also look at some studies of accelerated reader that was very popular at that time, and included that in some of these. Oh, thank you. Someone has put a link to that report so that you can take a look at that. So looking at this one question about the using a range of text, 3 or so, with increasing difficulty on the same topic for fluency and knowledge. This has worked great with your 3 and 4s in New Zealand, grades 4 and 5 in the US. I think that does align with what was in the report, as well as subsequent research, just not overdoing it, but expanding it. And as long as you're really focusing also on the AAA structure, accuracy first, try challenging text when students are ready for that, and they're ready pretty early. Challenging text, accuracy first, automaticity, accessing meaning, keeping it interesting, changing text for interest, as well as motivation, interest and learning. So the report also said, back to my presentation here, that none of the studies attempted to measure the effect of increased reading on fluency. So that was their question. Does silent reading or increased reading in general improve fluency? Nobody focused on that question, so they really couldn't answer that specifically. That was their real conclusion. So they said, at this time, it would be unreasonable to conclude that research shows that encouraging reading has a beneficial effect on reading achievement. They just didn't have the data to show that. And from their executive summary, they said, based on the existing evidence, and there was very little, the NRP can only indicate that while encouraging students to read, and that was silently, might be beneficial, research has not yet demonstrated this in a clear and convincing manner. So some of you who were around 20 some years ago, as I was, you may remember that when the report came out, at least I heard many people say incorrectly that the National Reading Panel has said silent reading is worthless. It's no good. You should never do silent reading. Throw out your sustained silent reading. No, silent reading is bad. The National Reading Panel says it's bad. No, they did not say that. This is what they said. Based on the existing evidence, we don't know. That's what they said. But again, when we don't have research that say we should do something or we shouldn't do something, when it's neutral, then we get to use our clinical experience. We get to use our best professional judgment. And My best professional judgment, Deb Glazer's best professional judgment, most educators that I know conclude that silent reading is absolutely fabulous for some readers to do. When we can get them to read, and making sure that when we do take a significant amount of time for students to read silently, that they're actually doing it. Anita Archer has some great ideas for doing that. Augmented silent reading, she calls it, making sure students aren't fake silent reading. But only some students benefit from silent reading. There are some who don't, and we can think about that developmental stages implied in Scarborough's rope, that when you're just beginning to learn how to decode, when you're just practicing decoding and decodable text, when you're just getting started with moving into that transitional phase of a more authentic text, we would not logically, it seems to me, spend a lot of time with silent reading. It's much more beneficial to listen for a variety of reasons, including the correction, that all important first bullet of accuracy. We need to be sure that accuracy is happening. So one of their questions was, should we be doing this? Can we do this in classrooms? And they said in the report that repeated oral reading is a good thing to do and should be done in classrooms. So they said, yes, you should be reading orally up to 3 times. The blue is a new addition. You should be reading challenging text. That's a new addition that was not in the report. And you should absolutely receive guidance or feedback. Accuracy is the foundation of fluency. You need to be sure the students know what the words are and what they mean. And they did not find support for silent reading. So I want to move on quickly. Please go ahead and put any questions you have about teaching into the chat, but I want to be sure that we cover what I wanted to share about the assessing piece of that, which was discussed in the report sort of tangentially. They talked about indicators of fluent readers, of fluent reading. And they wrote that the results of this study, meaning their review of all the research, indicate that teachers should assess fluency regularly. This may have been the beginning of all the fluency assessment we do these days in classrooms. Yes, indeed, we should be assessing fluency regularly. And they cited quite a bit of research for that, including my research. 1992, the little study that Jerry Tyndall and I did, they misspelled my name. So if you ever search for Hasbrouck, you're not going to find this citation in the National Reading Panel report because they misspelled my name, unfortunately. That report needed a lot of editing, but they did say that there's evidence for doing fluency assessments, and they can oral reading fluency can be used to assess fluency. Along with oral reading fluency, though, they also said that teachers could use informal reading inventories, miscue analysis, prosody rating scales, pausing indices, which is the way the NAEP essentially measures fluency, running records. And what they said we did was reading speed calculations. We would not call it reading speed calculations, but they said, yep, teachers can use all of these things. And I think we need to question that. Is that what we are really still thinking about? When we're now thinking in a more updated, sophisticated way. So this is what I wrote about again in the article that I wrote for the Reading League in their update. I said today, few would agree that reading speed calculations are adequate assessments of reading fluency, primarily because fluency is such a complex construct. It's not just about accuracy and rate. That's automaticity. Accuracy and rate together is automaticity. And that does still have a role. ORF has an important role to play, but the full construct of fluency is not measured just by looking at automaticity. So I see there are some questions. Sarah, when teaching secondary English learners phonics, how important is it to get them to be automatic each of the English sounds versus accepting their pronunciation? I think everything we know about these students is that development of reading in a new language that uses a whole different phonology and phoneme structure, we do approximations as they're getting closer and closer, and some, depending on age and different all multiple factors, may never get to that fluent, the fluency of pronunciation as a native speaker, and their overall reading fluency may be affected. But the research that has been done at looking at English learners and the use of oral reading fluency as an indicator has found that it generally, we always have to use our professional judgment about interpreting those scores, but it has been found even in English learners to be a valuable measure. Donna is asking, are we using CBM measures and applying ORF to assess? What about fluency screeners? I'm going to keep going because I think I'm going to address that, but ask me again later if I don't. But I think ORF still has an important role. ORF is one of a number of curriculum-based measures. If this is something that you know, if you're using an ORF assessment, especially if you're in any kind of leadership role, if you're a reading coach or you're making decisions about what assessments to use or how to interpret the results, I would strongly recommend that you get yourself a copy of this book. It's a thin little book. I have it here near my desk, but it is very thin. It really is the ABCs of CBM, but it really helps explain where these assessments came from, what they actually assess rather than ORF does not measure fluency. That's one of the things that this book makes very clear, but it is an ABCs. It's very straightforward, very clear. And I think there's so many people now using various curriculum-based measures, including ORF, who don't really understand what they are. So I would recommend that because we're just going to go over a light version of this today. What ORF measures is the number of words read correctly per minute. You know all this. We give students an unpracticed passage. They read aloud for 60 seconds. We have a standardized way of scoring the errors. It's a scoring protocol. We broadly now use these 20-some years or 40 years since ORF was developed. We are widely in all English-speaking countries using ORF, grade level text ORF assessments for screening. And we know that we score them in a standardized way. This all comes from research that's described in that book from about 40, a little over 40 years ago, came up with this scoring system. And when ORF was first invented, that's all it was. It was this procedure: find an unpracticed passage, usually at grade level, have the kids read it aloud, and score it using the scoring system. That's what it was. It was just a procedure. Nowadays, there are these entrepreneurial folks who have created and published specific ORF assessments using different passages, different scoring, slightly different scoring systems, different norms and benchmarks. But they are all very similar because they're all based on the same basic foundation of research. But the norms that Jerry and I created in our research, we did that because before there was DIBELS and Acadience and Easy CBM and all of those, just the procedures. Just teachers go find a book, open it up, have your students read aloud. But there were no norms when you thought about what should my third graders be reading. We had no guidance for that. So we created those norms. We've done 3 studies. One was quite a small one. It only went from grades 2 through 5 and involved only a few thousand students because back in the late 80s, early 90s, not that many people were doing oral reading fluency. But even this very small study got noticed eventually, and people started asking us for, and again, this is really before DIBELS was widely used and Acadience and Easy CBM hadn't been invented yet. So people were wanting information for different grade levels of students. So we did our second study, a much larger study. This was 250,000 students and went from middle of first grade through 8th grade. And then because the world moves on, we did a couple of years ago a third study. This time we only had access to scores through 8th grade. Through 6th grade. But when you look at the scores, they don't really change all that much. So if you do work with older students, you can use, they just didn't change that much, especially at the 50th percentile and above. You can use the scores from the 2006 study. This most recent study, we looked at scores from over 6 million students. It was a very, very large, large study. But what do we recommend? What are we looking for? I mean, is the 50th percentile what we should be looking for? Or should we push all of our kids to reach that automaticity level of the 90th percentile? Well, we now know that I hypothesized for a very long time based on my clinical experience that really the 50th percentile was sufficient. And what we do know now, because of some recent research, and I will tell you, thinking back about what Tim Shanahan, the work that we've done together over 20, he watched me present many presentations on fluency, and I would always, we need to get our kids to the 50th percentile. That's good enough. You don't need to be above the 50th percentile. And he would always say, I think it's really maybe the 75th percent, 50th to 75th. He agreed with me that it's not faster and faster and faster. It's not, we don't need to get kids to the 90th, but he suggested it was the 75th. And I am now convinced that he was right. He often is, I would say usually is. But this study really convinced me of that. Also an open access study, a large group of people did a study where they looked at the performance of students at the end of 4th grade in 2018 on the NAEP assessment, the NAEP being the National Assessment of Educational Progress used in the United States for decades, that measures students' comprehension. It is a widely recognized assessment of heavy-duty comprehension assessment that the students are doing, silent reading comprehension. And when you take the NAEP, the students are categorized based on their comprehension performance as advanced, proficient, basic, or below basic. And what this study did, and let me go back a little bit, the advanced really means that you can read and understand above grade level text. Proficient means you can understand adequately and quite skillfully grade level text. Basic means you can read and pretty well understand grade level text. Below basic is you're not reading well enough or understanding even grade level text. So what these folks did, and I'll go through this really quickly, is that they went back and looked at the words correct per minute, the automaticity scores, if you will, of the students in each of these categories. And I thought it was so interesting that our most recent study, end of 4th grade, the 75th percentile was 160 words correct per minute. And that is exactly what they found on the thousands and thousands and thousands of kids that scored at the advanced level. On average, their words correct per minute was 160, exactly our 75th percentile. So I was right, Tim was right. You don't need to push kids to read super fast. It doesn't do them any good. Our 50th percentile on our most recent study was 133. And we've always said, if you have any statistical background at all around assessment, you know the concept of a confidence interval, where it's not the score you're looking at, it's a range of scores that you always should be looking at on an assessment. So the research that's been done by many researchers suggests that for oral reading fluency, it's quite a big range, and around the 50th percentile, we should probably be thinking about the true 50th percentile as being somewhere between 143 and 123. And bizarrely, those are almost exactly the numbers that these researchers got for the kids who can read and understand grade level text somewhat adequately and quite adequately. They are at the 50th percentile. Or in that range. And the students who struggle with comprehension also struggle with reading words accurately and at an appropriate rate. So the conclusions for this, there's just not evidence that we need to push kids to read above the 75th percentile. And all of you who work with readers know that when reading is too fast, it can be detrimental to comprehension. We've had for decades, and this White et al. Study just adds more to this, that it's crucial that we help our students get as close to the 50th percentile on unpracticed grade level text as we possibly can, for sure, for comprehension and likely for motivation. Being fluent, we all know, fluency doesn't guarantee motivation. But if you're not fluent, you're not going to be a motivated reader. So an important takeaway, research suggests that the 75th percentile is sufficient for optimizing comprehension. The 50th percentile is necessary for comprehension. And Kim has asked here, somebody's asking if there is a recording. There is a recording being made from the beginning of this session about an hour and a half ago. Kim is asking, a colleague told me that Dibble's 8 ORF norms are different than the ones you have published. Yes, indeed. All of the published assessments, FastBridge, EasyCBM, AimsWeb, Acadience, Dibble's 8th edition, all created their own norms. And some of them look quite similar to ours, and some of them are quite different at various places. In general, if you understand about confidence intervals, they all align pretty well, but they differ because the passages differ. There's just different words correct per minute you're going to get when the passage is slightly different. But yes, Dibble's and all of them have their own norms that they created specifically for those passages. That's why when you're using those passages, you should use their norms and their benchmark guidelines. But our norms can be used as a backup, and our norms can be used when you're just having students read a library book or a social studies text or something on that order. So to summarize, what do we want? What are we calling fluent passage reading? The fluent passage reading, and that's what we'd be showing, not just fluency. Fluent passage reading is the ability to read unpracticed grade level text with sufficient accuracy, at least 95% and even higher for our emerging readers. We need to read at an appropriate rate, at least at the 50th percentile. So rate here being automaticity, words correct per minute, with suitable expression. And then we need to check for understanding. When we assess expression, we just have rating scales that we use. The Rosinski rating scale is a good one to use. The NAEP is a good one to use, but that's where we are with. There are people doing research to try to get technology that can do rating of expression. I know researchers who are working on that, but we're not quite there yet. We do have quite good technology. Microsoft has some really good technology, and there are others where students read into a microphone, and as soon as they're done reading, The computer can calculate quite accurately words correct per minute, can identify what errors the students made. That technology is pretty well established already, but prosody or expression still takes a human to make those determinations. So that's what I have for you. I hope that was helpful. That little QR code there is just to take you to my website, which is not really, I don't have a whole lot on my website, but that's what that is all about. So I'm going to, if I can figure this out, stop sharing, and let's see where I can do that. I've lost my little stop sharing, and go back to the chat, see if there's some questions that I need to answer, or any questions that come up now.
Yeah, I'm seeing some questions in the chat, and then I have a question or two myself, but if everybody could, yeah, put in any last minute questions there, we could
Good, I need to find
go
my
with that.
chat again. Oh, there it is.
So
All
I'm
right.
seeing, what about ORFs that have retail as a part of them? How does that play
Yeah,
into
what
that?
about that? Okay, let me step on some toes here. But here's what I know. I'm not making this up. Retail was added to ORF to please the public being teachers and parents. We all want to know what our students' comprehension is. That's why we care about reading, and that is so true. And we want to measure comprehension. We want to score. We want to be able to report to parents. We want to measure comprehension. So ORF, the original ORF that was invented over 40 years ago, did not have retail part of it. It was just words correct per minute, automaticity. Retail was added to make people feel like they were measuring comprehension. It does a very inadequate job of measuring comprehension. If you know the work of QCATs and all the researchers I revere who study, those brave people who study comprehension, they tell us all the time, you think fluency is complicated? Comprehension is the most complicated thing we can even attempt to wrap our heads around, and you cannot. I'm going to channel Hugh Katz right now, almost a direct quote. You cannot measure comprehension using a single measure because it's not a single thing. You can't do it. And retail is one of the weakest, I don't want to say the worst, the weakest ways of doing it. Now, so, and you look at those technical manuals, you've all deeply read the technical manuals for Dibbles and Acadians, I'm sure not. But if you do go look at them, they have to report what they found when they field tested retail, and what they got almost on all those assessments, as you're going to imagine, their inter-rater reliability is a coin flip. But they still put it in, even though it's no better than a coin flip, because teachers want it. It makes us feel like we're measuring comprehension, but it doesn't do a very good job. Now, having said all of that, I assess kids as often as I can. I love working with children and tutoring and assessing. I assessed a little rising fifth grader the other day on my dining room table out there. And she read a few things to me, and I asked her some questions afterward, and I had her do a little retail, because that gives me a sense of, did she get any of this? Is she paying attention? Is she processing this? But I don't come up with a number and say her retail was, 78% or anything like that. As a clinical practitioner, I'm always going to check comprehension, and retail might be one way I do it. But to put it as part of a score that we record and believe and measure over time, we should not be doing that. And the publishers know that, but they want you to be happy with their product, and they want you to feel, okay, I've said enough. I don't need to say anymore. You get it. All right, some questions. Helpful information. Thank you, Donna. Questions you left to answer. 30-minute allocation of reading spent in DEAR, paragraph shrinking, or other practice. When students are established readers, paragraph shrinking can be very valuable in an instructional, not just a practice. The difference between instruction is when there's a teacher there, can make some corrections and provide some guidance. Practice kind of implies you're out on your own or just you've got another peer practice. But paragraph shrinking can be very, very valuable once students are established, and we watch their performance really carefully. If this seems to be helping them, we should keep doing it. If it's just wasted time or confusing them, we should not do it. Is it helpful, effective to have students read easy text to build fluency and confidence? Only in those early stages. Only in those early stages. And that doesn't mean it's not about age. We have, you all know, I certainly have worked with adolescents and adults who are still struggling, vulnerable, transitional readers. They should be reading easy text, and they should be reading it several times, and they should be reading. But once they've broken the code, whatever age they are, 6.5, 16, when they've broken the code, our instruction, not our practice, but our instruction should be using challenging, complex texts. Tim Shanahan says that, and I say that, and a lot of people who have looked at newer research say that. Maze is pretty poor for comprehension, from my understanding as well. It's better than retail. It's better than retail. But again, one single maze, one single passage, you get a really high score, you get a really low score. What does that tell you? It tells you the kid did really well or very poorly on that passage, on that day. Go hunt down Hugh Katz and listen to him talk about the complexity of reading comprehension and assessing reading comprehension, and you will be much more cautious. Maze for comprehension. Yeah, I would use it. I would use it as an indicator. That's what we have to say. We need to check our students. We need to be sure they're accessing meaning. Reading doesn't happen without comprehension. We need to check it, but we need to understand we're checking comprehension, not really assessing it in a systematic way. You can do that. All the school psychologists and diagnosticians and special educators on this call know that you can really measure comprehension pretty well. It takes about 2.5 to 3 hours or more. Then you can say, after you've given multiple tests in multiple formats, done all kinds of configurations, at the end of all that, you can say, compared to their peers, this student's comprehension is adequate, good, or poor. But that's the only way you can really measure or assess comprehension. The rest of it is just check it. Yeah, comprehension session. That's right. You've got a whole session on comprehension coming. Fourth graders stuck at the mid-second level, not meeting ORF norms, would be helped with fluency by which practices? Always AAA. And you would need to do some diagnostic assessments on these fourth graders. Is the reason they're stuck because of, and very likely it is, decoding issues? They don't have the decoding down enough to read the words with automaticity. So the syntax and semantics and the overall fluency is not available to them because they don't have the foundational skills. The accuracy needs to be there. So do diagnostic assessments. Don't just do an ORF and then make your intervention decisions based on an ORF score. Don't do that. Do an ORF for screening, then do skills diagnostics so you can find out why they're not at benchmark on ORF. And for many of these kids, it's going to be the bottom of Scarborough's rope. For a lot of the kids, it's going to be the bottom and the top of Scarborough's rope. They need language development, background knowledge, work on various aspects of language and word reading, work on both of those. Over time, they will make progress.
Awesome. And I want to be respectful of your time. I know that questions could keep coming up and you could talk about it, and your expertise just kind of radiates off of you. But thank you everybody. And thank you, Dr. Hasbrouck, for coming and doing this. Yes, everyone's like amazing. It's been, the series has been great. You've been amazing. And I have all these questions now, and I hope that this encourages everybody to do kind of additional deep dives and
Yes.
keep conversations going.
Fluency is complicated.
Mhm.
We all
Yep.
know now here, you came in knowing this, but now you really know fluency is not reading fast. That's not what it's all about. It's complex. So thank you all. Yes, the core phonics survey is a wonderful way to assess our students. Yeah. Thank you all
Wanna
for your use.
I want to remind everybody our next session is going to be July 22nd, same time. We have Dr. Elsa Cardenas Hagen coming to present on vocabulary. So we do have a week off, kind of. We're not meeting back next week, but the week after, and you'll be reading the vocabulary section of the National Reading Panel report, and just super super excited for that. So thank you everybody, and have a good night. And yep, Carlene, the slides are on the Eventbrite participant page. All right. Good night.